Could you imagine what would happen for each of us if in one day or a week or a month, if we didn't have electricity, no electronic messaging, no hot water, no TVs, no evaluation week either? Because as Charles Gaffer used to say, the economy is only transform energy. In spite of all the potential we have in Africa, 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity. And so for these people, it is not just about not having electricity on one day for 1 month, or they simply do not have access to electricity, period. And 970 million people are using charcoal or wood fire. And the fact is that the African continent is not on the path of achieving the targets by 2030 in terms of electricity. And a major challenge that we have in Africa is the financing of energy projects. The political risks and credits are the major stumbling blocks for Africa. Providing energy is also another major challenge for the continent, with about 30 countries that are suffering from not being able to provide enough energy to their peoples and paying very high prices for their energy. And inaccessibility to energy is another problem, especially in the rural areas. In order to try to get as close as possible to the targets of the sustainable energy, we need to learn, to put together strategic plans, and to develop our knowledge. And evaluation will help us improve the lives of everyone. This session will be in 3 parts. Firstly, our keynote speaker, Dr. Nair, will give us some orientations, and then we will have a panel discussion, and we will end with answering questions. To those who will be asking questions, please use the Q&A on Zoom, so that we can have all the questions that you will be asking during the session, and we will be able to answer them, or at least provide the answers for future reading. We're going to start with the presentation of our keynote speaker. And I'm first going to introduce her, Dr. Nair Yugi, and I'm going to do it in English in order to avoid misinterpreting the contents of the introduction.
Is a senior monitoring, evaluation, learning advisor and monitoring, evaluation, and learning team lead at Power Africa. She has over 20 years of experience in international development and has worked as senior researcher, evaluation specialist, and program manager in the academic and NGO sector, and has health, economic, and civil society advocate for rural and hard-to-reach community. Dr. Nair has specialized in program evaluation and monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning training in the past few years, and has disseminated evaluation and research funding for peer review publication, conference presentation, and easy-to-read booklets. Dr. Neil has a master's degree and PhD in international development and a master's degree in monitoring and evaluation. She advocates for a systems approach to addressing development need and a non-negotiable focus on consultation, collaboration, and context. Interesting. Dr. Neil, the floor is yours.
I'd like to say hello to all the participants and thank you to the African Development Bank for inviting Power Africa to represent or to present how they use evidence and evaluation in the African continent to influence decision-making, planning, and response to energy needs in Africa. So if you look at my title, I say use in very big words. I've emphasized use of evidence and evaluation to Power Africa. And the reason for me saying this is because often in the field, you will find so many evaluations done, and often those reports sit on the shelf. The important thing in generally in the development sector, and especially if you're looking at what are the most appropriate needs, or how do you meet the needs of energy needs in Africa, is to actually use the results of those evaluations and to use the evidence that you see every day in your work. So this is why I put use as a very big thing. Okay, so in my presentation, I'm going to focus on the use of evidence and evaluation. But I'm going to talk about use of evidence and evaluation from two perspectives. So I represent Power Africa. Power Africa is a project within the United States Agency for International Development, that's USAID. And we're a foreign assistance program. So, and we work in different parts of the world, and we have several of our missions are situated in the African continent, and more specifically sub-Saharan Africa. So I will talk from that perspective as well, tell you about how Power Africa is working to respond to facilitating or increasing access to energy for the people of sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, I also draw from my experience as an African evaluator and as a senior researcher, and draw from all my experience of having worked in the African continent for the past 20 years. Okay, so I'm going to also look at putting Power Africa in context and giving you a sense of when Power Africa started and how we started and what our key goals and objectives are for moving energy in Africa and supporting energy programs in the African continent. I will also talk a bit about some of the evaluations we've done and how we talk evidence and how we see evidence. And it may be not necessarily the traditional way or not necessarily focus on program evaluations per se, but I want to bring into focus that evaluations do not only relate to program evaluations, but it's a continuous process of reflection and assessment and learning and adapting. And I'll talk to that as well. I end by looking at some key takeaways, and I say realistic evaluation. So looking at what is realistic within the African continent and ensuring that we focus on made in Africa evidence and evaluation. Looking at what the African people need and what are some of the key issues to consider when we're talking evidence and evaluation. Power Africa started in 2013. So when Obama came into power, when Obama was the president of the United States, his immediate response was, my foreign assistance program will be to Power Africa. So he had an ambitious plan to double access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa. Hence, Power Africa came into being. So Power Africa is a partnership initiative. So we work with about 172 private sector partners, about 20 development partners, and the 12 USG government partners. And of all of that, African Development Bank is one of our key partners. So they were there when Power Africa started. They influenced the initial strategy development for Power Africa and has continued to be a very close partner of Power Africa. Also to mention that our response in Africa is influenced by several priorities. So we have the US congressional priorities. And I'll talk to that just now, where at the very beginning, with drawing on lots of research, looking at what was happening out there in the market, what were the needs in country context, what were the needs in sub-Saharan Africa, we came up with a roadmap, which I'll refer to just now and give you more details on that. From all those consultations and bringing together a whole lot of think tanks, there were certain key congressional priorities that were identified. And that has actually influenced how we move forward. And some of those congressional priorities are ensuring that Power Africa meets certain targets, 60 million connections, 30,000 megawatts, and strengthening the enabling environment by 2030. And then outside of the congressional priorities, the way we plan and the way we use evidence is we look at contextual imperatives in Africa. What are the African energy needs? What are country needs? What's changing over the period from 2030 and up until current? And I will I'll also present that in my next slides as well. Then we look at policy priorities and what we're bound by. So, for example, Power Africa is bound by the Electrify Africa Act of 2015. And the purpose of this act was to encourage efforts in sub-Saharan Africa to improve access to affordable and reliable electricity in Africa, and this to unlock the potential for inclusive economic growth, job creation, food security, improved health and environmental outcomes, and looking at poverty reduction. So this is contained in the Electrify Africa Act, and it's Power Africa is guided by those policy priorities as well. And like I said, we are also driven by what's happening in the context. So what's happening in the African context, and I will talk a bit more about that, in terms of how we've strategized based on what information we constantly get from the ground, from our POCs that are working in the different countries, looking at market intelligence and how that's influenced our strategy and how we focus on context-specific responses. And this all comes from a continuous process of evaluation, of analysis, of getting knowledge from the ground, talking to our partners, talking to our major implementing partners that are responsible for doing the work for Power Africa in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a combination of processes as well. So where did we start and how did we incorporate evaluation and evidence in how we strategize? And I'm going to continuously emphasize that, how we bring in evidence to support and influence the way we respond to energy needs in Africa. So the very initial strategy that was developed was called the Power Africa Roadmap. Here we had very ambitious goals that were set. Like I mentioned previously, this comes from extensive consultation with African government departments, with academics, with various other think tanks, and drawing from all our partners as well. And based on that, we came up with these very ambitious goals of 60 million new connections by 2030, 30,000 megawatts. Sorry, that was a glitch on my part. 30,000 megawatts and strengthening the enabling environment. So strengthening the regulatory and policy environment within all these African countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And from that, we developed a theory of change that actually has guided our results framework, where we have key results and intermediate results, and from that, and which, based on those results, we have 32 indicators to guide monitoring of how progress is happening or not. And it's a continuous feedback loop where we use these indicators, we ensure that all our activities or our projects draw from our results framework, draw from our indicators, and continuously give us feedback based on all of that. I will talk more to that just now. In the roadmap as well, we had top-line indicators which were guiding us in terms of what was happening out there, what progress, what challenges, were we meeting our targets of 30,000 megawatts and 60 million new connections for businesses and households. What was happening in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So data was being collected for all of these key top-line indicators, the amount of dollars that were being leveraged between all our partners to support energy programs in Africa. Who was benefiting from all our programs? So we looked at beneficiary data as well, and then a huge focus on renewables. Since the Electrify Africa Act, when it was in 2015, one of the key things, if you look at the Electrify Africa Act, is looking at climate change and an emphasis on renewable energy. Okay, so that was coming in 2013, between 2013 and 2015, the Power Africa Roadmap was our strategy. And then from continuing to use that as a guide, in around 2018, we stopped and reflected. And I'm going to talk to you about the evaluations that were done at that point, drawing from our whole of project evaluations, drawing from the continuous analysis that we do, data analysis based on the quarterly data that we collect, drawing from the continuous learning that we've done. It was decided that we come up with a Power Africa 2.0 to adapt and respond appropriately to the changing energy needs in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's when we came up with Power Africa 2.0. And based on all these, on this whole project evaluation that we did, just before that, there was, it informed us that aside from focusing on the connections and the megawatts and strengthening the enabling environment, there should be more focus on transmission and distribution and building the transmission and distribution networks, looking at investment in infrastructure to support that, looking at cross-border trade. Also, another big thing, focusing on utility support. And I will show you how that also translated into our learnings and how we brought together our key task orders, our key major programs to work on all of this and to share knowledge. So again, from those evaluations, more focus on transmission and distribution, more focus on supporting utilities, looking at cross-sectoral engagement, that is energy and health, energy and agriculture, focusing on gender, etc. So that was some of the things that came out of our evaluations. You know, when Power Africa started, we had one big contractor that was implementing all Power Africa programs throughout sub-Saharan Africa. But one of the key things that came out of the evaluations is that there should be a more country and regional focus. So we currently, Power Africa's 5 key task orders working in the different regions in sub-Saharan Africa, and we have country programs, country-specific programs as well. For example, Ghana has their own program, Nigeria has their own program, and then we have a big off-grid project as well that focuses purely on beyond the grid technologies and support as well. And this all has come out from our continuous data analysis, continuous reflection, and our whole of project evaluation. We also draw from, like I said, USAID priorities and what are they saying. So one of the key things at that point was supporting a journey to self-reliance. So working with African continents, focusing on sustainability and how countries can become more self-reliant and become more capacitated to be able to take their development needs forward and address their development needs. So that is one of the key focus areas for Power Africa as well, is how do we do that? How do we draw more local private sector companies into the array of working with them as partners? How do we work more with African government departments, with the regulators, with policymakers? How do we do that to ensure that we're moving more towards self-reliance? So based on all of those reflections, even for 2.0, we came up with a new MEL plan, adapted indicators, all and adapted results based on what the changing needs were as we went along. Okay, next slide, please. One of the ways we look at evidence and evaluation, we don't focus on just program evaluations as the need to support our work. We look at evaluation as a process and we triangulate results. So we triangulate results from, so we do quarterly data calls where all our partners or all our implementing partners and our activities and our awards submit data to Power Africa every quarter based on the indicators that they are reporting to or that specifically contextualized to the work they're doing. So that's quarterly data, monitoring data. All activities submit narrative reports. So that's the qualitative aspects of it. Then we do biannual portfolio reviews. Now, the portfolio reviews look specifically at what's happening. We look at every activity that Power Africa has, look at their data, look at the indicators, what is the data telling us? We reflect on some of the key, on the progress that's been made, what are some of the challenges, what are the lessons learned, and we adapt as we go along. So each activity has to present it at the semi-annual portfolio review meetings that we have. And we looked at a shift over time in order to align with evolving administration needs and priorities, as well as what's happening in the fleet. So, for example, this reflection did underscore the transition to Power Africa 2.0 as well. And given that it is critical to take stock of what is working, what is flexible or rigid, and what to note where investments are leading to results. So we look at each activity, the regional task orders, the interagency agreements, the development partner MOUs, and consider questions such as which interventions or approaches have been most successful at adapting to new priorities and has led to the best performing results, what trends or areas of growth and areas of limited impact could be identified, and what needs to be considered for the next iteration of our Power Africa programming. So continuously ensuring that we're adapting, we're shifting based on political priorities, and we respond to key partnerships and budgetary shifts as well. So that largely is what we do our portfolio reviews as well. Then we have our Power Africa POCs that are on the ground, constantly in the field, meeting with partners, going to the Power Africa missions, assessing what is happening on the ground. So pulling data from the ground. Then we have market intelligence. And we draw on all of this market intelligence from our partners, from literature, and from various sources, even talking to transaction advisors that work on the ground. In addition to that, program evaluations. We've done whole of project evaluations, end of term evaluations, mid-term evaluations, and then specific evaluations based on when there's a need or something is happening out there and we want to know more about it. We would do those very specific rapid evaluations as well. At the moment, Power Africa is working on a huge CLA process where we have pulled all our major task orders represented at Summit, and I'm going to talk more about this. So my key point in this slide is saying evaluation is a process, and we triangulate results from various sources, and various ways of methodologies are used to gather data. Next slide, please. This is just mainly to show that it's a cyclical approach where we design programs, plan, and we use an adaptive strategy that feeds into the evaluation process. We continuously are evaluating, continuous data analysis, portfolio reviews, program evaluations, looking at what's happening on the ground. That then feeds into how are we strategizing, how are we implementing, focusing on reflective learning and adaptation, continuous consultation and collaboration. And that again feeds back into program design and adapting strategies. So it's a cycle of reflection, analysis, design. This is just mainly to show you how do we do our data analysis and how do we do our track our monitoring data. Like I said, it's all about the data. All our data determines decision making, the briefers we send to Congress. It's all based on what's coming from the ground and what's happening. Are we meeting our current targets? So we have country targets, we have activity targets. What's happening in terms of that? Is the activity data meeting their targets? If not, what is happening? What should we change? Why aren't they meeting their targets? So it's a continuous reflection and adaptation and learning from that. So this brings me to currently, 2022. What is the data telling us? At the moment, a lot of our big programs are coming to an end, either this year or next year. So we're in a process of redesign. We are going to be drawing from some of our major task order evaluations that are currently happening and some that have already happened as well. So major program evaluations. Aside from drawing from the program evaluations, the design team has done extensive consultations with NGOs on the ground, with all our missions in Kenya, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, in Nigeria. So we're drawing, because the mission staff work on the ground, they work with the local governments, they work with the regulators, the utilities, and they know what the requirements are and what the needs are. And that is all the information that we pull together to influence our designs going forward. And again, focusing on regional program evaluations, on our monitoring data. Again, portfolio reviews. We've just had a portfolio review recently, and that has some very interesting data coming in as well from that is influencing the design processes. So the design process are focusing on country context. We're looking at the huge challenges that we've just faced, COVID and health priorities, a huge focus on that and how we incorporate that into our new designs. Productive use and focusing on energy poverty as well. Those are some of the things that have come up in the last 4 years. How do we focus more on the productive use of energy? Again, localization, and this is a USAID priority right now. How do we draw in local partners and local stakeholders into the fore in order to influence design and implementation? And how do we ensure that we're building capacity to ensure that the program is sustainable, and that when we finally withdraw from sub-Saharan Africa, the program is sustained. Then a massive focus on climate change priorities, with COP26 just happened and COP27 coming up. Climate change has become one of the new administration's key priorities, and the new designs will ensure that every aspect of our work incorporates that. Not that we have not focused on it, we've always counted GHG emissions as well. When you're focusing on energy, GHG emissions, but everything now is climate change. But when you're talking climate change, one has to look at the reality of the context in Africa as well. Who's continuing to use fossil fuels and gas? South Africa continues to be dependent on coal and nuclear. So also being realistic to ensure that when we talk climate change priorities and we incorporate it into our new strategy, we focus on a just transition, a just energy transition. And South Africa currently Power Africa is very involved in supporting South Africa currently in the Just Energy Transition Partnership. But I'm not going to talk too much about it. Perhaps it'll come up in the panel discussion. So all of this has influenced a new theory of change for our new designs. We've got a draft results framework with new additional indicators as well to incorporate and to respond to all the additional aspects that are going into our redesign program. Next slide, please. This is just a draft results framework. You can see that the goal is focusing on advancing sub-Saharan African development through universal access to clean energy. The three key development goals is ending energy poverty, accelerating a carbon-free future, and bolstering competitive private sector investment in innovation in the energy sector. So this is just a work in progress, but these are the areas that we're moving towards focusing on. Next slide, please. How has program evaluations influenced and been incorporated into energy programming? I'm just going to give you two very quick examples. So in 2018, a massive whole of project evaluation, which was an end of term evaluation. And this resulted in key areas of refocus for Power Africa. Here again, when we developed our evaluation scope of works, there was extensive consultation with all the technical teams, the mission teams, to develop our evaluation questions. So the MEL team doesn't sit on its own and develop the evaluation questions. There's extensive consultation, bringing in the knowledge of all our technical teams and the missions as well to develop the appropriate evaluation questions so we get appropriate feedback for decision making and to influence strategy and implementation. We always focus on external evaluation, so we get an external contractor to do our evaluations. Methodology was a combination of quantitative and qualitative data collection and multiple data sources as well. And this was an evaluation that was coordinated throughout all the countries that we work with in sub-Saharan Africa. The dissemination, the contractors had a consultative workshop on the findings and recommendations, so we were able to influence and also comment on the recommendations as well as the findings. These results were disseminated into evaluation reports, summary findings, and handouts for easy reading. And some of the outcomes, key outcomes of that was, instead of one contractor working the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, we had 5 major regional task orders together with smaller awards as well. And we had a focus on beyond the grid, a task order that focused purely on off-grid solutions. And the emphasis again is on transmission and distribution. More currently, we've done regional midterm evaluations. So each of our regions using the same processes. We've just completed one key regional evaluation for the Southern Africa region. Outcomes more focused on localization or including local partners, a bigger focus on gender and looking at women in the energy sector. And again, I suppose this is would be known, more focus on mainstreaming climate consciousness in the way we focus on energy in Africa. So Power Africa has done a few evaluations and continuously program evaluations, and continuously this has influenced our strategy and how we implement and respond to energy in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. I'm saying in addition to everything I've said, some of the key takeaways will include what I've talked about, and specifically, I feel and I saw there was a session yesterday for emerging evaluators, and I feel it's my imperative to mention certain things, especially since we work in the African context. So my first thing is, please, as MEL people, don't be a spectator. Be involved from the very beginning of the process. Be involved in the design, through the implementation, the whole process, and also influencing and consulting around program evaluations. So always be involved from the very beginning. Because once a strategy is developed and you were not involved, it's very difficult to go back retrospectively and say, we should have included this. We should have ensured that we talked impact evaluations at the very beginning and ensure that data collection matched the need for the impact evaluation or whatever. So please be involved from the very beginning. Again, context matters. What's happening out there on the ground matters, and it should influence the way we design our programs, the way we implement, and the way we evaluate our programs as well. So basically saying, Evidence should reflect the reality of what's possible, again, within complex and divergent African settings. I don't need to tell you if you're working in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a complex, complicated energy sector. And that should be reflected in the way we implement and the way we strategize as well, and the way most especially the way we evaluate. People belong to evaluation associations in Africa. You know, there's a promotion for Made in Africa evaluations. So when I say Made in Africa evaluations, adapt your methodologies, your processes, the way you do data collection to customize it for what's possible in Africa. So you don't miss out rich knowledge and rich data from lay people, from people on the ground who have their own way of evaluating processes as well. So familiarize yourself with those new methodologies and ensure that you draw from African scholars in the way you shape and plan your evaluations. What is the reality? We work with multiple stakeholders, with multiple considerations. In sub-Saharan Africa, there's multiple role plays. For example, you have the foreign assistance programs like us, you have NGOs, you have government departments, CBOs, a multiplicity of stakeholders that are all working in the energy sector and all driven by budget priorities, policy priorities, country priorities. So that all should be reflected in the way you plan for your evaluations as well. Ensure that you're collaborating, consulting continuously, making sure that you adopt an inclusive process in the way you plan and the way you implement evaluations and the way you draw evidence or the way you do your data collection in terms of evidence. Most importantly, and I always say this because I've worked on the ground for many years in rural communities, let the people and their needs be central to planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Indigenous knowledge systems are amazing. People, I always say, people know what they want. They know what's happening in their communities, and they will give you rich evaluative knowledge in order to support your planning and your strategizing. And then again, finally, adopt a systems approach because one thing impacts on another. So we can't say we're purely working in the energy sector. Everything has a ripple effect. So look and start thinking through from a systems approach. Okay, thank you. I know I went way above time, but thank you so much. And I hope what I said was valuable and will guide evaluative thinking. Thank you.
I think that this presentation was very and highly captivating, and that is why I did not stop you, despite the fact that you exceeded your time.
Voilà. S'il faut retenir quelque chose de cette présentation,
What can I take home from this presentation? I think there are two aspects. The importance of the context, that is critical. And then the fact that you laid emphasis on use. We are working on energy resilience and clean energy, and the African Development Bank can rely on a multitude of evidence to redirect policy in the area of energy and green growth. The results of evaluations, findings, and teachings are shared with stakeholders for a better ownership. And what is needed now is action, more action. And yesterday's session showed us how evaluations are now used to influence policy strategies within the bank. But we should do much more. Indeed, the value of evaluation knowledge doesn't reside in their proliferation, as you said, but in their use. A quotation from Albert Einstein says, madness is to always say, to always do the same thing and to expect a different result. Madness is to do the same thing always while expecting different results. So habits and certain are very useful in changing the way we steer things. So thank you for having shed some light on these issues by focusing on use, utilization, whatever the quality of our evaluations. If the evaluation is not used, the findings are not used, then it is work in vain. So now we are going to start the panel discussion. The panel discussion will involve Dr. Ne, as well as colleagues from the African Development Bank, and I'm going to introduce them. I will start with Mr. Balde, Bachi Balde. I'm going to read his bio in English because I have it in English.
Over 35 years of professional experience across the power value chain and financing capital structure. He is currently the Director of Power System Development at the African Development Bank, which he joined in May 2017. Prior to joining IFDB, Mr. Balde was the Director of Power Business Investment Division at the Africa Finance Corporation. He has also been a consultant to the World Bank, European Union, BizClaim, and Government of Lesotho, and was the pioneer managing director of Ghana National Water and Electricity Company from 1995 to 1999. Mr. Bachi is a non-executive director of the IFC and Development Bank of Nigeria. He also served as the chairman of the board director of Kabeolika SE and Saint Power Operation and Service Limited, and an alternative director and technical committee member of Benin Electricity Distribution Company. Mr. Balde holds an MBA from Boston University and bachelor degree honor in electrical and electronic engineering from Newcastle upon Tyne University in the UK. He is a fellow of the Institute of Directors Southern Africa. C'était difficile pour moi de traduire ça en français, Monsieur Bachi. Donc, voilà.
It was difficult for me to translate that into French, Mr. Balde. So, the second panel member, I would say the third panel member, is Mr. Monojet R.
Mr. Pal is a division manager in African Development Group, Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Department. He has worked in the energy sector for about a decade with a focus on innovation, climate finance operation, special initiative, and developing a new business line. Prior to that, Monojet worked in IFTV private sector operation department on a variety of investment operation and initiative. Before joining the IFDB, Monojet worked in a corporate planning and with a management consulting firm. Alors, après cette présentation de nos panélistes, nous allons essayer de structurer notre discussion.
So after introducing our panel members, we are going to structure our discussion by addressing a number of questions. The first question is as follows: how can the countries select infrastructure that is tailored to suit their environment? That is the question for your attention, dear panel members. And I'll give the floor to whosoever would want to go first. I would repeat the question: how can countries select infrastructure that is adapted to their environment? Well, perhaps I may set the ball rolling while you are thinking through your answer. I know you already have your answers. I just wish to point out the fact that Africa is at a crossroads. And as you're all aware, Africa is one of the continent most vulnerable to climate change and climate variability. Therefore, is heavily inclined towards joining the effort at combating climate change and strengthening its adaptation capacity. At the same time, African governments have committed to industrialization and developing their economies to create jobs and wealth. Accordingly, selecting the future growth path of the continent will require that Africa be able to do both. That is, focus on climate change, economic development, and the issue of ecological transition. That is what is before us.
So yes, I think you're right. You've outlined, thank you for outlining some of the sort of main considerations. And I think in terms of infrastructure development to align with the SDGs, and in particular SDG 7, I think maybe we could focus on two broad aspects. You've already touched on them to some extent, is the nature of the energy mix to maintain a low carbon development trajectory. And the other is a sort of increasing energy access, which is much needed. And here this comes down to the sort of the choice of solutions, how much to extend the grid, how much to focus on decentralized solutions. If one looks at scaling up renewable energy, I think this shift is already underway. If you look at reports that sort of look at renewable energy capacity numbers over the last decade, you'll see a sort of an increase of about 75%, admittedly from a relatively low base, but it is quite a significant movement. And I think that also sort of ties in well with the bank's funding for renewable energy investments as a proportion of its generation-related investments, and it sort of matches roughly the same number. So you can say that as countries have been transitioning, the bank has been part of that transition, and the transition is fairly broad-based. And I think you see a variety of countries, large, small, landlocked, coastal, ranging from Cape Verde. I think you mentioned Cape Eolica, Bachi's role in Cape Eolica, for instance. Cape Eolica using, given their sort of context, wind power, a couple of years ago, very, successful project, relatively small, but, reasonably large size for the Cape Eolican context. Countries such as Egypt, which are in Morocco, which is sort of, running large programs, both on solar and wind, of course, at, significant scale. We have other countries such as Kenya, sort of looking at they're developing a whole host of solutions, but being in East Africa, they have access to geothermal energy. So geothermal is one of the resources that they're developing, and that provides sort of stable baseload power to them. So you find countries sort of looking at various solutions to sort of increase security of supply, to look at increasing rural electrification, to sort of diversifying sources. So I think you can see this broad-based transition already in play and sort of scaling up as we go forward. In terms of the approach, countries and the African Development Bank, and traditionally most institutions like the bank, have focused on expanding the grid network. That's absolutely essential and must continue, and at a more rapid pace. But equally, I think most evaluations and sort of recent reports have shown that to reach SDG 7, there also needs to be a focus on distributed solutions, especially on rural areas where access rates are really, really low. I mean, in general, access rates are, over 40% of people don't have access. Now, if you go to rural areas, it's sort of even higher. So decentralized solutions are crucial, and they need to be integrated into national level plans. Regulatory frameworks need to be put in place or strengthened, as the case may be. And the bank has been sort of engaging in this, and I think taken a leading role. For instance, over the last couple of years, we put in place something called the Green Mini Grid Market Development Program. It has various elements like a help desk for developers, also sort of light touch advice for governments, and sort of there are cases where we mapped out sites in certain countries and sort of contributing to helping develop the enabling environment. More recently, we put in place a program called the Leveraging Energy Access Finance Program with the Green Climate Fund, and that focuses on 6 countries, which cover more than a third of the sort of the population. That needs to be electrified in some ways, and this will sort of focus on decentralized solutions, solar home systems, mini grids, and CNI. So this is just another point in terms of approach, but I think clearly all institutions now recognize that decentralized is a key element of focus to reach universal energy access over the next decade. Thank you.
Avant de passer à la deuxième question, je vais juste rappeler que
Before going to the second question, I just want to recall the assessment of speakers in the area of renewable energy. And this has highlighted a number of emerging obstacles in order to reach an agreement on the most efficient financial incentives and government guarantees for private investments in electrical power stations. Secondly, there's a lack of clarity and guidance on the future of renewable energies in terms of needs for new investments, who, when, as well as the role of the private sector. The lack of clear forecast in this area is hamstringing in investments. Moreover, there's a gap between the various phases of production, transition, and distribution. There is a mismatch. In fact, there are cases where power stations were built and ready to generate electricity, whereas the transmission lines were not in existence, such that the government had to resort to paying energy, which I would refer to it as gym energy, that is turning to independent energy producers. Assessing electrical interconnection projects has highlighted the fact that there's need to look at the tariff adjustments and look at how electricity can be exported. But most of these mechanisms have not been factored into bank projects. So there are shortcomings in power purchasing agreements between the countries and independent energy producers. So there's a problem of capacity of government powers to be able to negotiate power purchasing agreements with private entities equitably that are backed by private legal entities. So I'm going to turn to Mr. Dachi, who is fortunate to manage a power company. How do we assess new and renewable innovations in this sector, mindful of the rapid changes that occur in the market? Thank you.
I think the way I'll answer your question is I'll put a framework that will guide countries and regions and investors. So the strategic framework for the bank is the New Deal for Energy in Africa, which cuts across the power value chain and has aspirational targets to light up and power Africa. We have on-grid, off-grid, and a whole mix of instruments that we deploy. And as we speak, that strategy is undergoing a midterm review. We also are responding to market changes. So, for example, the energy policy is also, the review of the energy policy has already commenced. Because as you said, the energy space is changing very rapidly in terms of disruptive technologies, business models, and more recently, geopolitics, as we are seeing. So the way we support countries really is to help them build on their governance framework. This is our utility transformation agenda, basically. And when we say governance, it's right from the policy dialogue level, heads of state, ministers, right down to the utilities themselves, board of directors, management, right down to the project level. If you have those systems in place, then it becomes easy to have a dialogue and to engage local investors and partners. And then integrated risk cost planning is critically important, because this is where you have a 20 plus year plan that shows what types of technologies and capacities you need when, and then how you want to finance them. So South Africa is a good example of an integrated risk cost plan. Once you've got the plan, and that plan now feeds into what they call long-term strategies in the context of climate change. And these long-term strategies are what will feed into the nationally determined contributions and projects that are in those programs. So if you're not, if you have a project that's not in your NDC, it's not so-called Paris aligned. But once you've got the plan, you must raise the money. And this is where climate finance, blended finance comes in, project preparation. Every dollar counts because our countries are undergoing, should I say, fiscal distress in the geopolitics. Even the richer countries are having financial constraints. So we must use every dollar more efficiently across the project cycle and project development cycle. So I think that's the broad context. So once you have these long-range plans, and you know that you need, what should I say, X megawatts in year Y, and you need to produce Z gigawatt hours in year Y, then you can now plan how to sequence the investments and which partners this money should come from. And that is what will drive affordability. So we support countries to develop their tariff policies in terms of cost of supply studies, etc. Once you've got your planning right, the most important aspect is the human capital development, getting the skills in the right place at the right time and retaining those skill sets. And again, we partner DFIs, IFIs, and local institutions. And I would say fourth element is what we call sector reform and sustainability. And this is where you look across the power value chain from generation all the way to distribution. And as we said earlier, IPP generation model has been proven. We don't need to revisit that. That's why Power Africa pivoted to transmission and distribution. And we've been partnering Power Africa in that area since 2019. And if you don't have transmission and distribution, as you rightly said, Joseph, there's no point having a lot of generation without efficient transmission and distribution. And there are serious mismatches in terms of take-or-pay obligations, etc. And we do support governments through technical assistance, getting them consultants. A good example is the Africa Legal Support Facility, where we deploy them to help governments. But that is really sometimes not sustainable. The private sector knows what it wants. It's generally more sophisticated. It is extremely important that we help member countries understand how to sustain the sector. And this is basically through tariffs, cost-reflective tariffs. You can't, if you're collecting less than it costs you to produce, that's a losing proposition. So you must collect what it costs you to produce. Number two, in some areas where you want to create a market or rural electrification, you must have subsidies, but this must be smart and time-bound and sustainable. So tariff policy is extremely important. And lastly, regional integration and partnerships. So for example, I'll give you two examples. So in terms of take-or-pay that's aligned, I think Kabiolika is a good example where it's 25.5 megawatts in about 100 megawatts, and the penetration is 20%. And that technology has been scaled up to Lake Turkana in Kenya, 300 megawatt. But 300 megawatt in Kenya is not a lot. So the size of your IPPs matters. If they're too big, then you have a problem. Then you have the mismatch that you say you're paying for energy you're not receiving. And that's a very serious problem. But to solve that problem, if you have regional interconnections, like between, say, Ghana, Burkina, Djibouti, Ethiopia, then even if you're oversized, you can now sell your excess energy to your neighbors. So Jamaya in Chad is a good example. We have a 30 megawatt there, but potentially Chad can do 300 megawatts of solar through maybe our Desert to Power initiative. So this sort of planning and collaboration is extremely important. Lastly, we should not compete as donors and partners. Each donor has a comparative advantage. And as Power Africa said, the countries know what they want best. So if we have that in mind and we size and plan things properly and use every dollar that's available to have maximum impact, then I think we'll have the desired results. So I hope I've answered that problem. So countries with excess capacity, especially renewable, should sell to their neighbors to help them transition and accelerate the transition. But that transition must be just. And in the energy mix, I just want to put this lastly, that it has to be a combination of some conventional and renewables, depending on the natural endowments of the country. And here you don't, install capacity means nothing. So if you have all the money today in all our countries, it will take time to build a hydropower plant, probably to take 7 to 8 years, 10 years. Solar might be quicker, but you can't have solar at night. So you really have to look at each country or cluster of country and see what's most optimal to get them sustainable energy. And energy security cannot be compromised, as we are seeing in Europe. You know, energy security trumps everything. Without energy security, forget it. So you don't hear wind and solar solutions to Germany during the current crisis, for example. Thank you.
I'll invite Dr. Nair, the sustainability of the gains that we've already made in the area of energy.
In my presentation, I emphasized the whole issue of sustainability and what one needs to ensure that we include the local people in and building capacity as well. So my thing about ensuring that the gains are sustained is to ensure that from the very beginning, you are not developing or working in a silo, developing your own plans, deciding what's necessary for each country in terms of energy needs or energy responses, but that you work with local partners, you work with local governments, you work with your local regulators, policymakers, and bring all of them together from the very beginning, because ownership is also key. And people will only own the process and the strategy if you involve them from the very beginning. And another big thing that I'm big on is learning by doing. So how you building capacity is by people being involved and by learning by being involved in the process and actually doing what's required. For me, that's the biggest contributor to sustaining knowledge, sustaining gains, and ensuring that it remains in the countries or the regions where those gains were achieved. So for me, the long and short of it is that, bottom line. Ensuring that there's enough consultation, we're collaborating across energy responses, we're building capacity as we're going along, and we're putting local people at the center of those processes to ensure that the gains are sustained over the period of time, and it remains even when foreign assistance programs withdraw from the country and when key stakeholders or funders are no longer funding programs. So that for me is the long and short answer to it.
Thank you. So just, I mean, in terms of sustainability, I think there are multiple levels, and I think what Dr. Nair mentioned about beneficiary ownership is absolutely sort of crucial and key. And I think if I think of go back to the evaluation that you led, Joseph, about a year and a half or 2 years ago, I think overall the sort of sustainability of the bank's projects was sort of generally judged to be sort of quite likely, especially on elements such as ownership and ENS issues. There might have been an area of concern around sort of sustainability at a wider level, and this is why I think the point that Bachi alluded to, things around and in response, I think we'd be looking at things such as the Sustainable Utility Transformation Program, which Bachi talked about a little while ago, so I won't get into that. And I think, and maybe just linking back to what I said earlier about decentralized solutions, I think we can also look at alternative models where the load on the sort of utilities is reduced. And I think I can take the case of a project that we're working on in DRC. It's a good model of collaboration because we're picking up from work that was initially funded by the UK in terms of sort of selecting sites for mini grids, working with the government to sort of run a competitive tender process, and we're coming in on the financing side, bringing both regular financing plus combining with concessional financing. So it's a blended finance approach, and this is going to bring power to 3 towns. So they're effectively sort of off the grid, but they're mini utilities in some ways, and each of these towns will have between 5 to 10 megawatts of capacity in terms of the solar PV installation along with battery storage, and will probably sort of provide access to 35,000 people over over maybe a 5-year period. And these are sort of standalone projects in the sense that there is no burden on the utility. I mean, there is upfront cost to sort of defray the higher upfront costs, but there is no straight contingent liability that's coming onto the utility. So I think these are models that sort of contribute to improving the sustainability of sort of energy access programs. So and as we run through this potentially be a pilot for many other projects such as this. So just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Can I add to?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Based on what we're currently doing in Power Africa, and we're working on currently, we have a learning agenda program. So we're working on collaborating, learning, and adapting. So we've pulled all our major programs together. We've got representatives from all our task orders, and we have specific focus areas. And the intention of this is to ensure that we're sharing knowledge, that people are sharing achievements, they're sharing challenges, they're sharing lessons learned. Currently, we have 4 key learning agendas that are focusing on transmission. So we have a transmission technical group, we have a utility reform learning group, we have an on-grid connection learning group, and then there's a focus on gender. Now, the intention of this is to say, how can we come together? How can we share progresses that have been made, innovations in the way we respond to energy needs, lessons learned, so we don't go out and make the same mistakes. And these can be replicated and shared across the different countries in the African context. It's worked very well where people have shared knowledge, it's been applied, it's been incorporated into strategy and implementation. And in some ways, you are not reinventing the wheel, you're sharing what works, you're working with collaboratively, and you ensuring progress is sustained across the continent. So just another way of ensuring that there's sustainability of gains made.
I believe that evaluations have revealed that we need to look at the financial viability of the companies. And Mr. Batier talked about the tariff issue, and sometimes the political or the policy decisions of governments may not match with the provision of good, reliable quality electricity. So we need to have a good tariff system and be able to respond to electricity supply demands. Mr. Batier, you've been working with our countries on tariffs. What is your experience with regard to the dilemma of supplying electricity and then looking for finances that are not viable?
Tariff policy and tariff structures and levels are extremely important because they drive viability. So if you have the design right, so that you send the right pricing signals to each class of consumer, whether it's residential, commercial, industrial, they're all paying their fair share, then that's an important starting point. But for whatever political reasons, the government may want to subsidize certain classes. So, for example, the bank will support the country to do a cost of supply and service study that will tell you the tariff for each customer class should be XYZ. But because, say, if you take Lesotho, for example, they wanted to subsidize low income and industrialized customers. So you have cross subsidies. So that's part of the tariff design. So it's a conscious decision of a government to support a certain customer class. But it must be sustainable. That's the point I'm making. Mm-hmm. Because if it's not sustainable, you are really dipping into taxpayers' money. So, for example, rural people that are not connected, if you use their taxes to subsidize rich people in urban areas, frankly, that doesn't make sense. But we see that a lot. Number two, if you have industries and you want to industrialize, and you may decide to support certain industries with cheap tariffs because of jobs, depending on the country. So again, for example, in Zambia, for example, we're doing a cost of supply study, and the balance between the mines and different classes of customers, that's what's being discussed now. But once you've got the tariff right, and you've got the impact right, and you have what I call technical equilibrium, the electrons flow efficiently from generation to distribution. But more importantly, the cash, the money, is all about cash flow. The money that you collect from consumers is what pays everybody upstream. And if it is not enough, of course, you have a problem. So that is the balance and the importance of tariffs and reforms. In terms of institutional framework and regulations, we have the Electricity Regulatory Index that looks at regulators in different countries and identifies gaps for us to support the countries. In terms of sector reforms, we did a study over the last 10 years. What types of reforms? Are you unbundle, rebundle, integrated, vertical, whatever? Frankly, it doesn't matter. What matters is that your institutions are strong, you have the right skill sets, and that you have consistent policy dialogue and an environment that can attract private sector. But private sector is not a panacea. You cannot be waiting for private sector that never comes. If you do a project finance deal, it can take 10 years. Some projects have been in the works 15 years. Should the countries say they're waiting for private sector? No, you must provide power to your people and use the resources you have efficiently. Lastly, I think in terms of skills and sustainability, it must be a PPP, public-private partnership, right from the policy level all the way to the project and investment level. So for example, many of us in ADB, my boss, Kevin, VP Queno, etc., we all came from the private sector to a development bank. And because we know the other side, we can help our countries better. So that sort of rotation and partnership, I think, is extremely important. And here the diaspora also will become extremely important, not just in terms of skill sets, but investment dollars that they can provide. And also, the technologies that they can bring. And in that regard, we partner all the utilities. There's something called APUA, Association of Power Utilities. We brought all the CEOs in Dakar, to have this dialogue. How do we collaborate South-South? So Egypt, for example, can help other countries that are not so developed in wind. South Africa can help countries that are not so developed in terms of power pool development and power trade, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Effectivement, les connexions.
Indeed, the electric interconnections at regional level can promote climate resilience because they benefit poor countries, and these countries can get electricity from neighboring rich countries. So there are conditions that are necessary, political will and others included. The other question I'd like to ask is as follows. It has been covered previously, but I'll still ask it. What are the obstacles to accessing power? They go beyond infrastructure. I'm talking about legal frameworks, the use of subsidies, and long-term use by communities. So I know you addressed this previously, Mr. Battier, specifically when you talked about tariff structures, institutional framework, etc. What role could the bank play to support access to energy and electricity supply, in your opinion?
Oh, okay, Joseph. I think that I'll just give you two examples. I think maybe the best example is one that IDEV already did an evaluation on, the Kenya Last Mile Connectivity and Transmission Project, which is a program. And in the early phase 1, there were some lessons, there were some gaps in terms of studies, the connection fee policy, etc. And those lessons were brought on board. And basically, the government took a decision to increase electrification rate led by the utility. So the connection fee policy was revised so that you pay a limited amount or nothing, and you repay over 3 years, for example. using prepayment meters, which enforce collection. You understand? And the tariffs should also make sure that the utility that's doing that can afford it. So the commercially viable areas must be ring-fenced from the commercially viable areas, so that the utility that's driving that project has the right subsidies and support to drive electrification. But it's not just electrification, access. No, access for what? You must use it for productive uses, and as an individual, community, or whatever. So I think that's the way to go. And that model has been used as far back as early 2000s in Lesotho. For example, I was involved where it was all credit meters, and within a short period, it's all prepayment meters. And you can see that across the continent. You now have smart meters, because now if you have solar home systems, and the bank is doing a pilot project in Ghana, where consumers can actually sell their excess power to the grid and become, prosumers, as they call them. So there are all sorts of things happening. The latest is green hydrogen. Everybody's talking about green, gray hydrogen. So just this week, we had a workshop where all the parties came to Abidjan. And what will that mean for energy supply and access and electrification? So we're following the new technologies, etc. But the key is not just access. Access for what? So another example is in Nigeria, where Lagos State is using the US cooperative model, electric cooperative model, to do a pilot project. And we hope to take that project to the board. And there we've partnered with Power Africa, who supported NRECA to do the feasibility studies, for example. Thank you.
OK. Merci vraiment parce que vous avez abordé.
Thank you very much. You've raised one of IDEV's suggestions, which is the use of infrastructural solutions that are integrated, taking into account climate change and the impact on infrastructure. Necessitates a different design of projects before infrastructure and was deployed in an isolated manner. But the fundamental question is that why do we need electricity? If it's to light up homes or industries, etc., that's one thing. But if it's to develop localities, then you need to find support measures to attain that objective. So integration is key. I'll come to Dr. May for the next question. And it is with regard to mobilizing funding or resources. The energy sector in Africa has or will be undergoing significant changes in the coming years. And Africa will need to mobilize more resources to move to this transition. What is Power Africa doing in terms of resource mobilization?
The way, like I said at the very beginning, Power Africa is a partnership initiative. And one of the things that we do is we look at mobilizing funds from all our partners that are involved, the development partners, the private sector partners, our interagency, where we pool funds for the way we respond to energy needs in Africa. So that's one of it. The other thing is we use, and the way we work with and provide support to specifically private sector partners, local partners, is leveraging funds from institutions such as the Development Finance Corporation. So I'm going to be very brief on that. I won't be able to talk too much on that subject matter, but knowing that it's a partnership initiative, we use our partners to leverage funds to ensure that support goes out to our private sector partners, to our major task orders that are responding to African energy needs in the continent, and also ensuring that there are loan guarantees for smaller partners or smaller groups that actually work in the energy sector that require energy support. So depending and working a lot in partnership with the Development Finance Corporation. Thank you.
Thank you. Je pense que vu le temps, on va peut-être, on va peut-être discuter en solo une autre fois parce qu'il y a beaucoup de choses à discuter, mais il faut qu'on donne un peu la parole aussi aux participants. Et je vais voir s'il y a des questions. Bon, une question pour Dr. Neil. Est-ce que Power Africa intervient uniquement dans les pays anglophones? Je crois que c'est... Because I know
and we respond appropriately because we have obviously our task orders that have French-speaking people or not only French, if it's a Portuguese-speaking country, so you have appropriate teams that work in all of these countries. So definitely not in Anglophone Africa only.
Okay, another question from for you, Dr. Ne. How much of a data and evaluation from your multi-plunge monitoring and evaluation strategy are available publicly, and where can we find them?
Almost all. Our quarterly data is publicly available. You can contact the MEL team. I don't know if I can give out my email address. We have a MEL team. We have a MEL specialist that works specifically with the data. Then we have a contractor, DTS, that works with all our megawatts data as well, that can also support that and make certain data available. So that's the quantitative data. We have quarterly narrative reports as well, and our program evaluations will be on the deck, USA deck.
Do you have plan for your coming project?
Do we have plans for upcoming projects?
Yeah. Did you plan some impact assessment? I don't know if the question is about rigorous impact evaluation or not. It's not clear here.
So for every new design or every new strategy that we have, we incorporate evaluations. So we have inbuilt evaluations, inbuilt monitoring, a monitoring program. We adapt our indicators to suit the strategy. So currently, like I said in my presentation, we are redesigning because most of our major task orders are coming to an end. And for that, we have a draft results framework in place with new adapted development goals and results, obviously incorporating the new requirements and ensuring climate change is incorporated into absolutely every aspect of our results framework. At the moment, we are completing a few big evaluations. So yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered your questions, but we always incorporate monitoring, evaluation, and learning into our strategy and our project plans. And every implementing partner that we work with has to have an activity M&E plan. So they have their MEL plans and they have to align their MEL plans to the Power Africa MEL plan. So indicators, evaluations, learning are all aligned to what's happening in the country and aligning to giving us feedback. And the reason for that is so we can do comparative analysis across countries and across regions based on the data that's submitted to us every quarter. So yeah, but if I haven't not answered your question, you can email me.
Yeah, maybe I may say that some answer the participant may receive some answer by email because now we are trying to managing time. Yeah. So it's difficult to wrap up with all this good information. The way I will try to summarize it is just to recall some kind of recommendation we made with our evaluation. L'une de ces recommandations consistait à renforcer l'assistance de la banque.
These recommendations was to strengthen assistance to regional member countries in them to develop security, energy security, and energy conservation plans, term plans, and they should use non-lending instruments, and also we should strengthen dialogue. And you said such a dialogue should be continuous. And we also said that the crux is electricity, especially as regards electricity independent producers, and the financial uh, sustainability of these companies is of the essence. Therefore, the bank should increase assistance to member countries through utility companies in order to ensure that the power system is strengthened. In a nutshell, this is what I would say. The sustainability of these utility companies should be strengthened because it's really the crux of the matter. Well, if a company is not sustainable then financially, it will be difficult to crowd in the private sector. Well, having said that, I don't know if you have any comments to make before we conclude. First of all, I'd like to ask participants not to disconnect because there will be a survey at the end. Please answer these questions. Do not disconnect, but feel this forum. This will help us better organize future meetings in order to be more useful and more efficient. The questionnaire is going to be displayed on the screen. Please answer. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Yogi here, and thank you to Mr. Rebo Alde and Mr. Tebal for sharing their evaluation and operation experience. Also, on behalf of IDEV, thank all participants for their time and for participating in the debate. Even after the meeting, we have an open door policy. Please feel free to send us questions and any queries. I would like to thank the organizers of the NGM Gate and the others. And finally, I would like to thank our interpreters and also the IT team for their priceless support. I wish you all a very nice day. And once again, thank you very much indeed.